Hello everyone, I hope you all are enjoying Connect.Tech Online 2020. Welcome to my talk, Next.JS on AWS. My name is Nader Dabbit. I'm a Senior Developer Advocate on the AWS Web and Mobile team. I'm also a web and mobile developer by trade and an author. My current book is Full Stack Serverless, available from O'Reilly Publication. So let's go ahead and jump right in. At the end of this talk, I hope you kind of walk away with an understanding of how to kind of implement a unified data layer across not only Next.js apps, but really any of the more modern web frameworks that implement anything that's in addition to client-side rendering. And this talk is really broken up into two main parts. One is mainly how to kind of show the deployment process of Next.js on AWS, and the other is this comprehensive data layer and auth layer on the client, server render routes, and API routes. So before we jump into the AWS part, let's take a step back and take an overview of Next.js. So if you look at Next.js and you find a definition online, or you go to their website, you might see something like a web framework built with React. But this is a huge undersell of what Next.js is. So let's dive a little deeper to kind of learn a little bit more about Next.js. So when you think of deploying a typical React application, say you create one using Create React App, what you're going to typically be getting is a single page application with client-side rendering. What Next.js brings to the table is the addition of pre-rendering HTML to client-side rendering. So you still get client-side rendering, but you also have server-rendered and statically generated pages that are implementing pre-rendering of HTML. And you can do this using server-side rendering as well as static site generation. So pre-rendering HTML typically just means that there is some process, be it a server or some build step, that takes your JavaScript and turns that JavaScript into an HTML page and renders that, and then that's kind of what you're serving as opposed to executing some JavaScript function or something like that. And pre-rendering of HTML brings a few benefits that client-side rendering does not bring you. First of all, increased speed and performance. Because you already have processed everything and all you're kind of serving is this HTML, there is less processing to be done. Therefore, the HTML can just be served. You also have much better SEO. The crawlers do not have to kind of go through your JavaScript and understand what's going on. You're just giving them HTML, so it's a lot better and a lot easier for them to understand. Also, you typically have better resiliency, scalability, and security when you're working with pre-rendered HTML. There's two main ways to do the pre-rendering of HTML, and there's two ways to do it with Next.js. The first is static site generation. Typically, the HTML is created during some build step. So you have a build process that runs. You might run this via your CI/CD process or via your command line. And this kind of goes through all of the pages and creates the HTML. Once this HTML is created, it can then be served at the edge via some CDN, making this a lot faster for all of your users around the world, not just where you've ever deployed your application locally. And if you're serving any type of data in this static site generation process, it typically is going to be prefetched during this build phase. Now you can also have dynamic data that's kind of generated and worked with on the client, but any data that you'd like to be generated during this build step needs to be done during that build step. Server-rendered HTML is done on demand, and this typically is going to be rendering the HTML on every single request. So you hit this page, when the page gets hit, the HTML is generated on that request. So therefore, you need some type of runtime execution, and this can either be a server or some type of serverless function. You're seeing mostly this done for Next.js apps in an AWS environment, or even in some of these other deployment processes using serverless functions. And that's what we're going to be kind of taking a look at today. So which one do you typically want to work with? Do you want to work with static site generation, or do you want to work with the server rendered page? Well, the Next.js docs make this very straightforward. They say we recommend using static site generation over server-side rendering for performance reasons. Statically generated pages can be cached by a CDN with no extra configuration to boost performance. However, in some cases, server-side rendering might be the only option. So how does Next.js know whether to statically generate a page or to server render a page? By default, Next.js is going to statically generate every page in your app unless it's an API route or unless you've exported get server-side props. You can also fetch data during the build phase for a statically generated page using getStaticProps. Any data you return from this function in the object that's returned will be available in that component as props. GetStaticProps generates HTML as well as JSON files, both of which can be cached at the CDN at Edge for increased performance. You can also dynamically generate routes and pages using getStaticPaths. So let's say, for instance, you have a blogging app and you have n number of posts, depending on how many posts are created. And at build time, you want to go ahead and generate routes for each of one of those posts. GetStaticPaths will allow you to do that. And then from there, you can also dynamically pass data into that page at build time using getStaticProps. So a combination of getStaticPaths and getStaticProps. Now, to enable SSR for a route, you export a function called getServerSideProps. And if you export this function from a page, Next.js will pre-render each page on each request using the data that's returned from getServerSideProps. And then all API routes are server-rendered routes. Next.js comes built with a few scripts by default. You have dev for development mode. You have build for building either locally or in your CI/CD process. And then after you've run a build, you can use npm run start to go ahead and start a local host. You can also set your application to be only statically generated. So for instance, you don't want to use any API routes, you have no server rendered routes, you just want a static site. You can run npm run export to generate this static site. One of the interesting things that happens when you run a build is Next.js gives you this nice overview of what the pages that have been built are and kind of information about them. So it tells you if a page is a statically generated page, if it's a server rendered page, or if you've used or exported any of these functions like getStaticProps. So it's pretty nice to be able to go through and look at everything that's going on after you run a build. Now let's talk about deploying Next.js on AWS, or I guess Next.js in general, and what the things that you might want out of the box are for kind of this type of deployment. Well, for a statically generated page in general, like within your site, you want all these pages typically to be served from edge locations because you want that low latency and that low cost. You also typically want the assets in the static or public folders to be served from the edge automatically. For server rendered pages, you want to be able to take advantage of all the stuff that Next.js has to offer, so things like getServerSideProps and API routes. And then you also want the benefits of having the at Edge for rendering all of the other static assets and things like that. Next, let's talk about how to deploy Next.js to AWS. We're going to talk about doing this in two different ways, one using the Amplify Console hosting service and the other using the serverless framework. So currently Amplify Console only supports static site hosting, so if you would like to use SSR support or API routes, Amplify doesn't support it yet, but it will be here in a couple of months. To enable hosting with Amplify, you would run Amplify add hosting, and then to deploy Next.js in the static site deployment mode, you would then update your build script to add Next export. You could also deploy Next.js with Amplify going into the Amplify console, connecting Git repository, and then during the setup process, updating that build script to add the Next export command. But the thing we're going to be focusing on today really is deploying using the serverless framework. The serverless framework has a Next.js component that allows you to kind of add everything you would need out of the box with just a couple of lines of code. So you can opt into SSR support, API routes, and everything that you would probably expect when deploying a Next.js app. So let's take a look at a couple of services that enable this, one being Cloudfront and the other being Lambda Edge. So Cloudfront is a managed service from AWS that is a global CDN. It allows you to serve static content like videos, images, and HTML, as well as dynamic content like APIs. And there are currently over 200 edge locations, and these edge locations are increasing in number all the time. So, a few years ago, it was less than 100. Now we're at over 200. Lambda Edge is an extension of AWS Lambda that allows you to run Node.js code at global edge locations. So you create your function at a single location, it replicates to all of these over 200 edge locations. And Lambda Edge runs your code in response to events that are generated by Amazon Cloudfront. So they kind of work together in the sense that Cloudfront will take the request and then invoke the function that is living at Lambda Edge. So to work with Lambda Edge, you would find the region probably closest to you. So let's say you're on the West Coast, you might be taking advantage of one of the US West locations. You would deploy your function. In this case, it would be deploying a Next.js app with something like an API or an SSR route. And then Lambda Edge will automatically replicate that function across all of the different edge locations, over 200 edge locations around the world. And then when the user makes a request to the site, it's going to serve the function from the closest location to the user. Now, to enable the deployment with with a serverless framework, you're going to go ahead and create a file called serverless.yaml. And then from there, you just need to add 2 lines of code or 2 lines of configuration. First is the name of your app, in this example, my next app. And then you need to specify the component, which is the serverless next component. And then you would specify the most recent version and the time of this live broadcast or this event. It's the version 1.16, but in the future it might be something else. So if you're watching a recording of this, you might choose a different version, whichever is the most recent version that is available at the time. And then once you've specified that configuration, you can deploy using the npx serverless command. And this will go ahead and deploy everything to CloudFront for you. And then from there, you can then iterate and make updates by running npx serverless again. Now you can add additional configurations. So for instance, let's say we want to add a custom domain. We set an input property, and then we can here set our custom domain to whatever domain that we would like. And then you would just need to configure this domain in Route 53 in your AWS console. You can do other configurations as well. So for instance, let's say we want to set a default cache policy for everything in our app, and then we want to go and we want to do more fine-grained cache policies for different routes, like our API routes or specific routes. We can also do that as well. You can then also set caching policies for the public and static directories. So if you're serving assets and you want to kind of have more control over the caching policy there, you can set that. There's a lot of different settings that you can actually do. So if you were interested in learning more about this, I would check out the Next.js serverless component and kind of see what all is available there. But one of the things that we really want to focus on in this talk is API interactions. One of the things that we've added in the Amplify libraries recently is SSR support, allowing you to enable all of this support using a new SSR configuration. So when you're configuring Amplify, if you're using one of the more recent versions, you can now set a flag called SSR and set it to true. And this is going to switch on a flag and allow you to work with some of the newer APIs that we have available that enable SSR support. And when you're typically working in these types of environments, there's 2 main pieces that you're working with: auth and data, and often a combination of auth and data. So let's take a step back and look at how data worked on the client and not taking into consideration SSR support. So if we're just fetching data from the client, we would import the API category from AWS Amplify, and then we would call API.get or API.graphql, whatever, and we would have our data and we would work with it. Now, if you'd like to use the API client on the server, you can also now do that. And the way that you would do that is you would import with SSR context utility, which is new, and then you would take the context that has passed in either into the API route or to the server rendered route, and you would destructure that API category. And from there, you can then make authenticated API requests from a server rendered route or an API route. So this means if there is a signed in user, you're automatically going to have access to that user session, and you're going to be able to make authenticated API requests without having to write any additional code to kind of enable this. And the same thing goes with auth. So if you've worked with auth on the client, you would import auth directly from AWS Amplify. Now on the server or in a API route, you would instead import the with SSR context utility from Amplify, and then you would destructure auth off of the context, and then the auth component would automatically be able to recognize the user session. In this example, or in this case, it would be from the cookie passed in via the context. So let's take a look at some code. Here is an example of an API route, and let's say we want to check if a user is authenticated in an API route. The only thing we need to do now would be, instead of just importing the API component, we would import with SSR context. And then in the actual function itself, we would destructure the auth class by passing in the request into with SSR context. And then now we can start making calls to determine if the user is there, and also what metadata is associated with the currently signed in user. And one of the really interesting things is kind of combining auth and data, because when when you have a signed in user, you can then start doing things like authorization and fine grained access control on your data layer using the currently signed in user. So now with the new SSR support, you can do this using both get server-side props as well as in the API routes. So let's say we wanted to have an authenticated API request on the server. We would import the with SSR context utility. We would then, in the get server-side props function, be able to destructure the API component from with SSR context, and now we can make an authenticated request. So let's say this is a protected endpoint. If the user is not signed in, this is going to error out. If they are signed in, we're able to get the data. Also, that user session is passed in to the request. So if we want to kind of determine who that user is securely on the server, this would take care of everything for us without having to do any extra work, no extra utilities or anything like that. So let's take a quick look at a demo to kind of see how this works. What I have currently running and what I'm going to go ahead and show real quick is an example of an app that's running. So I have a Next app, I have a profile page, I have a protected SSR route that is currently using the old version of Amplify, or the old way of doing things. And it says I'm not authenticated, but I am indeed authenticated. We also have a protected client route, which actually recognizes that I'm signed in, because we're not using the SSR support just yet. So the client stuff works, but the SSR stuff doesn't work. We also have an API route. So if I go to /API/check-user, you'll see that there is no user, but there is a user. I'm signed in. So like, why isn't this not working? That's because in the past, you had to do a lot of work to kind of get the session passed from the local storage into the session, the cookie that's kind of used, at the SSR route or the API route. So let's update this app to use the new SSR support. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to this protected route, and instead of importing auth, I'm going to import with SSR context. And what I'm going to do is go here, and I'm going to say const auth is equal to with SSR context, and I'm going to pass in the request. And then I'm going to go ahead and save, and we're going to try to try this protected SSR route. And you're going to see that now we are authenticated. So this is actually working now. The next thing we want to check out again is our API route. We want to have our user available, in this API route. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to check user, and then instead of importing auth, I'm going to import with SSR context. And then I'm going to go ahead and say const auth is equal to with SSR context, passing in the request. Save that. And then now if we go back to our API routes, we see that we have all of our user metadata, because we are indeed signed in, and we're getting that user information really easily just by changing a couple of lines of code by using the new with SSR context utility. So just a couple of lines of code, everything works. So it's a pretty nice API in my opinion. But again, one of the things that our team is working on and that we're focused on doing and improving is kind of building this unified data layer across the entire stack in all of the modern web frameworks. If you'd like to learn more about this, check out the docs at docs.amplify.aws. I also have a post called The Complete Guide to Next.JS Authentication with AWS that goes into some of this. And then I have a part 2 that should be out in the next couple of days that talks about the data layer as well. And one of the things that we're always focused on my team is that it's still day one. So even though we've done some work here, we still have a lot of things that we want to do and a lot of ideas. So if you have any ideas, A lot of the stuff, everything that we're doing actually that I've just shown off here as far as the client libraries are concerned is all open source. So feel free to jump in, open an issue, take part in an existing issue, and come up with anything that you'd like us to work on and suggest it, and we'd be happy to do so. So thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the event.